Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday the 18th of February. My name is Brian Liddy and I'm joined by two guests today, by a regular visitor, Hugh Marshall, almost said Williams there. I'm sorry, Hugh. And Keith Brown, MSP. Welcome to you both and thank you for giving up a chunk of your weekend for us.
Okay. Good to be here.
Thank you. So today's Ukraine update, day 725. Volodymyr Zelensky issued a desperate plea for fresh arms on yesterday, after Ukrainian troops pulled out of Avdiivka, handing Moscow its first major military victory since last May. He told the Munich Security Conference that the slowing of weapons supplies was having a direct impact on the front line and was forcing Ukraine to cede territory. Zelensky also told world leaders not to ask when the Ukraine war will end, but instead why is Putin still able to continue it, as he underlined the threat Russia poses beyond his own country and called for more support. President Biden said he had told Zelensky that he was confident the US Congress would renew war aid, but added that without American help, Kyiv could lose further territory to Russian advances. Biden told reporters that failure by US lawmakers to approve new funding for military aid to Kyiv would be absurd and unethical. A number of Ukrainian troops were captured by Russia during their withdrawal from the town of Avdiivka. Alexander Tarnavsky, the Ukrainian commander responsible for forces in Ukraine's southeast, has said. The Russian Defense Ministry said on Sunday today that Ukrainian forces had left that place name again, Avdiivka. Forgive me for mispronunciations. The Russian Defense Ministry said on Sunday that Ukrainian forces had left Avdiivka and were entrenched at the nearby Avdiivka coke and chemical plant in Ukraine's Donetsk region. Russian forces shelled and fired missiles at a series of cities in eastern Ukraine on Saturday, killing at least 3 people and leaving others under the rubble of shattered buildings, Ukrainian officials said. 2 cities close to the front line in eastern Ukraine's Donetsk region, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, came under fire. And further north in the town of Kupiansk, 1 person was killed when a 2-story house was struck by Russian shells, the governor of Kharkiv region said. Ukrainian forces shot down 3 Russian warplanes over eastern Ukraine on Saturday. The country's Air Force chief has said this claim has not been independently verified. Kamala Harris criticised Donald Trump's cajoling of Russia to attack NATO allies of the US who don't pay their dues, saying the American people would never accept a president who bowed to a dictator. The idea that the former president of the US would say that he, quote, encourages a brutal dictator to invade our allies and that the United States of America would simply stand by and watch. Harris said no previous US president, regardless of their party, has bowed down to a Russian dictator before. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said on Saturday he had discussed the prospects of peace with his Chinese counterpart, part of a long-running bid to bolster relations with Beijing. Kuleba said he had discussed with China's top diplomat Wang Yi about Ukraine's plans to hold a global peace summit, which Switzerland has agreed to help stage. Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny's mother and his lawyer were told on Saturday that he had been struck down by sudden death syndrome, his team has said. Another lawyer of Navalny's, however, was told by the Penal Colony's Investigative Committee that the cause of death had not yet been established. Navalny's spokesperson said, G7 foreign ministers have demanded that Russia fully clarify the circumstances surrounding Navalny's death. Foreign ministers of the UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan and the United States met in Munich on Saturday. So there's a couple of items in today's Ukraine update that we're probably going to be talking about later, namely Trump and Navalny. Keith, yes, Keith, was there anything that struck you from today's Ukraine update that you'd want to?
Yeah, I think the other thing that's happened just in the last, 24 hours or so is the UK government at last making a decision on the extension of visas for Ukrainians, which is very important. I Myself hosted a Ukrainian family for a number of months until they managed to get into full-time employment and their own housing elsewhere. And I know that they and many others have been waiting to find out. And it's very, very hard to make plans, especially if you have children, if you have no certainty of your continued right to stay in this country whilst the war in Ukraine is going on. But I think it is very concerning in more general terms to see the advances made by Putin in Ukraine. And if I know this is different threads to the same story, but if we want to understand the importance of supporting Ukraine, then I think we have to look at the face of Putin and what he's done in terms of Navalny, and think about the way that he's treating the sovereign country of Ukraine. If we lie down to that, if we accept it and don't fully support the efforts of the Ukrainians, then it will come onto our doorstep in due course. So even if it's only for our own self-interest, and I would argue it should be much more about defending the sovereign rights of Ukrainians to their own territorial integrity. But even if it's in our self-interest, we have to maximise the support. And for that reason, and again, it's a different thread to the story, I very much hope that the US will be able to bring forward that $60 billion or so of support that Ukraine undoubtedly needs, given the most recent setbacks.
Thank you, Keith. Hugh, how's the perspective from Wales on Ukraine at the moment?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's interesting is obviously, we've got a big election year, both here in the United Kingdom, but also in the United States, and we've had Boris Johnson coming out with his full sympathy this week. We have to remember that Johnson and others of his ilk would like to see Trump being elected as president. It was interesting to see that Putin himself said that he would prefer Biden winning the next election because he would provide more stability. But again, one would imagine that was done intentionally to try and encourage more people to support Trump. So, there is an element of destabilization there. And it is sad that, that the reliance on, United States funding has a direct impact. We know that Zelensky said today that the withdrawal that we've seen in the last 24 hours was down to the lack of weapons and munitions directly as a result of the cuts from the current sort of cuts from the United States. So I think there is a duty now for European countries to up their game, and I think NATO this week were asking sort of all sort of NATO members to up their production of munitions in order to support Ukraine. And I think that at least now Patriot missiles, for example, are being manufactured here in Europe. But obviously, as with Russia, Ukraine, and the situation in Israel, we need peace, and we need to sort of bring an end to these wars. Because I say the only people who are benefiting from it appear to be arms companies and dictators.
Thank you, Hugh. And now we move on to I think Navalny's. Forgive me, I'm told not to say the voice in my ear, but isn't Navalny coming up later? Okay, so Navalny, this sudden death syndrome. Navalny was only aged 48 when he died, and he's an incredible figure by all accounts. He was a Russian opposition leader, a lawyer, an anti-corruption activist, and a political prisoner. He organised government demonstrations, ran for office to advocate reforms against corruption in Russia. At the age of 21, as of 2021, he had more than 6 million YouTube subscribers, social media channels, and his team published material about corruption in Russia. And 2 criminal cases were brought against him, which were both widely considered to be politically motivated and intended to bar him from running in future elections. And so I don't know who to come to first. Hugh, is it fair to say that this death is really suspicious, and the reason that Navalny has spent so much time in prison of late is because Putin feared him?
Yeah, I think it is quite, the timing is interesting. I think it is worth mentioning that obviously he almost died from being poisoned. I think it was Novichok, the preferred poison of the Russian state, it would appear. So he had serious sort of health repercussions. So he wasn't a well man. He wasn't, even though he was only 48, he was not in a great position. And obviously, he'd only just reappeared because nobody knew where he was. And he appeared in this penal colony on the outskirts of the Arctic Circle. And the conditions there, sort of Russian penal colonies are notoriously harsh regimes, but also the weather there is very harsh. So, how he died, we don't know. You would hope that they would have the decency to release his body to the family for them to give him a proper burial. But again, that would give away the real reasons behind his death. So we can't believe anything that Russia say. But what is sad, it's good to see people out protesting. But I saw this morning that a young woman had been sentenced to 2 weeks in prison for mourning his death. So Russia is in a really bad place at the moment as far as democracy goes. And it's difficult to see an end to it. But incredibly brave man. He could easily have just lived in Germany and carried on his campaigning from there. But he decided to go back, and almost he knew that this would be the conclusion. But I think he realised that in his death, that there's a very powerful message.
Yeah, thank you for that, Hugh. Keith, so maybe two questions for you. Has Navalny come to this end because Putin feared him? And is there any plans to have any kind of debate, or is this going to be discussed in Holyrood?
It may well be up to individual members. It probably wouldn't be a programmed debate, but it may well be that an individual member wants to make it the subject of a members' debate. And can I just say that I think Hugh's absolutely right. We should really pause for a second to pay testimony to the incredible bravery of Alexei Navalny, given the circumstances that he faced, and given the fact he chose to do this, to speak up for democracy and human rights against a despicable dictatorship. And he did that knowing the risks. He foretold his own death. So my condolences would certainly be to his family, and I would hope it would act as a point of inspiration for those that are trying to restore democracy in Russia. I think, though, as Hugh says, it's also very murky. I had a very credible commentator saying he can't really see the rationale for why there would be a decision to execute, has been mentioned on TV this morning. Execute Navalny. It doesn't seem to work in Putin's interest, but you cannot believe anything that's said by Putin. I think, again, as Hugh said, it's such a murky environment. We can't trust, from given previous lies that have been told by the Putin regime. You can't trust what they say. So it's very hard to work out exactly what's going on here. There was a video, of course, of Navalny just the day before his death, when he did actually look, despite the circumstances which Hughes mentioned, in really good, rude health, joking on camera with the judge in the latest show trial he was forced to endure. So it's very hard to work out what's there, but it's quite obvious. One thing that is very obvious is the nature of this regime under Putin, where he has a very high tolerance for the deaths of others, for the economic carnage that his war in Ukraine is causing to the Russian people. And that's why we have to be as strong as we possibly can be. I do agree we should be trying to stop wars wherever we can, but we cannot lie down to a dictator like Putin, because he will not accept anything other than robust opposition if he's to be thwarted in his plans.
Thank you, Keith. So I'll move on to the situation in Gaza. So figures show that at least 28,858 Palestinians have been killed and 68,667 have been injured in Gaza since the 7th of October. These are scenes in Gaza seem to me almost like something out of the Bible, the Old Testament. So how much longer can the world allow the Israeli government to attack hospitals and bomb Rafah? Keith, I'll come to you first. What do you think about the situation in Gaza?
It's just horrifying, and some of the scenes you're seeing, small children being taken out by snipers, whole buildings being taken out with hundreds of people in them in order, we're told, to get at one Hamas representative or terrorist. Whichever the justification for Israel's actions from the horrible events of the 7th of October, it cannot be right to use people, civilians, as this kind of collateral damage. And it is horrendous. And there's two things, I think, which need to happen. First of all, the world's got to speak with one voice to say this has to stop. Now, a lot of military people will tell you that it's always the case that when you have a ceasefire, there's a real danger it can work in the interests of one party to a greater extent than the other. And that's understandable that a military power will want to take that into account. But what we have here is not a straightforward battle between two military powers. We have a civilian population right in the middle of this that's taking the burden of the deaths. Entire families being wiped out, now being herded into a small part of Gaza in Rafah, seeing their entire environment destroyed around them. That can't be right, and it can't be justifiable. So we do have to speak up with one voice. That's why the SNP will be laying, under Stephen Flynn, a motion in the UK Parliament this week calling for a ceasefire. It shouldn't be a difficult thing for the Labour Party to support. There can't be a good reason why they wouldn't want to support a ceasefire in Gaza just now. And what we don't want to see is some of the stuff that we've already seen this weekend of weasel words from Labour saying, well, we've got to see the motion. Well, the motion's been published, or starting to pull different stunts as to why they can't support a straightforward call for the ceasefire. Now, that was one thing. If we can get a united voice, I don't expect we'll get the Conservative government to support that, but at least if the opposition can come together to support that call for a ceasefire, that is helpful. But what really needs to happen, in my view, is for President Biden to take a more active role in relation to this. Israel has to be made aware of world opinion and what's happening. They have the support of many people because of the horrendous attack on the 7th of October. And people understand that Israel wants to protect its citizens, but they cannot be unaware of the generations of hostility that the current actions in Gaza are going to make sure happen, because that will go on. This will be a breeding ground for resentment that will go on for many, many years. And to that end, the best thing that can be done is an immediate ceasefire to make sure we get humanitarian aid in there and we stop the killing of innocent civilians. And I think, as well as governments and politicians around the world speaking up in favour of a ceasefire, we have to see the US working with others to make sure that Israel is aware of the weight of world opinion in terms of the incredible number of deaths that we're now seeing in Gaza.
Thanks for bringing up the SNP's upcoming Opposition Day motion on a ceasefire. Both Labour's MPs in Westminster, Mr Shanks and Mr Murray, Keith, if I can stay with you because you're SNP, they've got an opportunity to atone for their previous. They didn't vote, did they? They abstained, and now they've got another opportunity. Do you think they will vote this time, one way or the other?
Well, they voted against, as has been said. I don't know. It should be an easy thing for them, given not least that their conference in Scotland this week has supported the call for a ceasefire. And they are two Scottish Labour MPs, and we're told that Scottish Labour MPs will take their cue from Scotland, the Labour Party in Scotland, and not from the UK. So it should not be difficult for them to do that. However, seeing what we're seeing just now on TV with the likes of David Lammy looking for any excuse to not just say, yes, we support a ceasefire, I do wonder whether people like Ian Murray and Michael Shanks will find the backbone to support this call for a ceasefire. It is not really, I think, a difficult thing for them to do. What is the alternative? You're asking for what's currently happening to continue happening. The ceasefire will allow humanitarian aid to go in. It will stop the killing of civilians. Why not support a ceasefire? But I have watched the Labour Party play these games over many years. And if they simply just look for excuses, denigrate the SNP who are trying to get this vote for a ceasefire, then it wouldn't surprise me. But I hope for better from the Labour Party.
Thank you, Keith. And Hugh, I'm sorry to keep you waiting. What, when it comes to this ceasefire vote this week, how do you think Labour MPs in Wales are going to vote?
Yeah, I think one or two voted in favour of the ceasefire last time, and again, you would hope that more would do this time. But I think this lays bare that the fact that Welsh Labour and Scottish Labour, that they don't actually exist as parties. They are branches of the UK party that is led by Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer is the leader of the Labour Party. The members for Scotland and Wales, and we're currently in the process of selecting a new leader of Labour in Wales and therefore a new First Minister. They are branch managers. So Starmer clearly, he is pulling the strings. So it'll be what he says that's going to have the biggest influence. But hopefully, they will develop a backbone and do that. And as I say, the SNP and Plaid Cymru have been clear throughout. The Scottish government and even sort of Labour in Scotland have been in favour of a ceasefire, as have, in fairness, Labour in Wales as well. So the Labour Party in Wales and Scotland are at odds with the leadership in Westminster. But as I say, what Starmer says goes these days.
Thank you, Hugh. Yeah, I think we're already over time on this topic, but it's interesting. I think I'm right in saying that the Labour conference, Scottish Labour conference in Glasgow today, at the moment they've voted. Oh yeah, we've got a conference coming up later, so we'll save that for later. But so moving on to Donald Trump, he's been fined $350 million for fraudulently inflating the value of his properties, and yet he continues to lead the polls to be the next US president. How successful has President Biden been, and should the Democrats be considering a younger candidate, and if so, who should that be? Hugh, I think it's your turn to go first. I've been hearing talk about there's possibly being a third candidate, but nobody can really seem to decide who that might be, whether it's going to be Michelle Obama, Kamala Harris, or some other unknown person who's going to come in at the last minute. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it is unfortunate, but we are society as a whole is ageist, and unfortunately, sort of Biden has never been the greatest communicator. But when he has been, we had the dropping of the charges against him with relation to the classified documents, because the prosecutor was saying that they wouldn't be able to successfully prosecute him because of his memory issues. And obviously there was a partisan element to that, but it didn't help then in the press conference where he was sort of rebutting that statement that he mixed up the presidents of Mexico and Egypt, and it is something that he's done throughout his career. But it was interesting. I listened to CNN quite a bit, and it is quite interesting the position there that they think that it's it is almost too late now to get somebody in instead of Biden. There is the potential, obviously, for not just Biden versus Trump, but having a third candidate, because I think the opinion Trump is ahead. I don't think there's no great love for Biden or Trump, apart from their bases. So a third candidate could have an influence. Kamala Harris is seen as part of the Biden problem. I don't quite understand that myself, but obviously I'm not that close to US politics. But I think a younger, more dynamic candidate would probably energize the voters. But I think one of the biggest influences in this election, hopefully, ironically, will be Taylor Swift. The fact that she's mobilizing younger people who tend not to vote to register and get out there to vote. Hopefully, it's anybody but Trump. But Trump, is who he is. It was interesting to see him in his sort of defence of, the charges that have been brought against him, actually lying, saying that the actual numbers that were used in court were far lower than the actual numbers. So he actually confessed in an interview afterwards to actually having lied about the numbers that he provided in the first place. And what's interesting as well is, according to sort of US law, he has to pay interest as well. So even though it's 350 million, I think the actual figure is nearer 450 million. But luckily, he's launched a range of shoes today, so hopefully that'll help him cover his bills.
Thank you, Hugh. Keith, do you agree with Hugh then that anybody but Trump and possibly even Taylor Swift?
I think, as Hugh says, most people are now saying it's too late in the process to have, if you like, a replacement candidate for Biden. It's worth just pausing a little bit on the Donald Trump stuff, though, because to think that somebody would say that they would encourage a dictator like Putin to attack NATO allies if they weren't paying their dues as he sees it, it's just an appalling thing to have said. And it gives you an insight into what a second Trump administration might look like. An appalling thing to have said. An appalling prospect to consider as well, that Trump may get back in if the polls, as we're told, show him certainly easily winning the Republican nomination, but also ahead in the general election for president as well. So, and I do think there's been, I don't know, I'm not close enough to know whether there's been real complacency on the Democrat side. It was, to me at least, a fantastic result for Biden to have won the election last time. But I had assumed, and what I know, that what would happen is that Kamala Harris would be placed and positioned in such a way that she would become the successor, as often happens, vice presidents to the previous president, would become the nominee next time round. I think there is a real degree of ageism, of course, stoked by Trump, ironically enough, around Biden. And we have to judge him on what he does. I'm not been at all happy with, as I've already mentioned, the too light touch he's taken in relation to the situation in Gaza. But he has done some very good things in relation to the economy and employment and the environment as well. But I also think it's worth saying, if it ends up, as I expect it will, a Biden-Trump fight, although the one thing that might upset that is further legal action against Trump, of course. If it ends up in it, I don't think it's a done deal that Trump will win that, even if he's ahead in the polls just now. And it's an interesting point raised by Hugh that if people like Taylor Swift can mobilise young voters who otherwise very often don't vote, then I think then there's a possibility that it could be that Biden would win again. But yes, I think there's been complacency on the Democratic side, making sure they've got somebody lined up.
Thank you, Keith. So I'll move on to our next item. In the same week that British Gas returned £751 million profit and NatWest made £6.2 million pre-tax profits, the UK economy went into recession. Scotland was dragged out of the UK dragged out of the EU by the UK, and now it's been dragged into recession with the rest of the UK. Keith, I'll come to you as you're a policymaker. What are the policies that are needed for a just transition and growth in the economy? And so what's the view from Holyrood, basically?
Well, I think first of all, it's extraordinary the level of profit, especially as compared to the level of increase that we've seen in energy costs, which are, we've kind of moved on a little bit from discussing the cost of living crisis. But before that, we were talking about the cost of energy crisis, which is a fundamental human need. And I've seen figures, and it's hard to know exactly what's true. Each time you try to challenge these huge profits and the huge costs of domestic energy for people, all sorts of things are said to explain why that's the case, but they haven't explained why in France the increase has been around 4% and in the UK around 40%. And people can't afford that. Too many people can't afford that. And I'll tell you one thing that strikes me is that, like many people, paying direct debit, you accumulate a very substantial credit balance. I think in my case it was around £1,400. So I asked for that money back and I was refused. And part of these profits are based on energy companies taking money from people, banking that money, gaining interest on that money, and I think that's completely wrong. We're also seeing the SNP certainly challenging the situation with regards to standing charges. Now, that's not to pretend that if standing charges were abolished, these are what you pay regardless of how much energy you use, then it won't find itself back into bills. But the basic point is we need to have, in a country that's so energy rich as Scotland is, which frequently provides all its energy needs through renewable energy these days, and we export our energy mainly to England. Whether it's, you're talking about £300 billion that's been made by the Exchequer in terms of North Sea oil, or whether it's the renewable energy that we generate and pass on. And yet in Scotland, of course, we get charged extra to connect to the grid. There's a further tax on people in Scotland. So the point I would make is, what we have to have in Scotland is the ability to regulate our own energy markets and our own energy supply. That way we can further boost the move towards renewables, further limit the use of fossil fuels for all the reasons that we all know about. But we can control our energy and our energy costs in the interest of the people of Scotland. And of course, for that, you need independence.
Thank you, Keith. Hugh, is there anything coming out of the Senate about these kind of profits that the energy companies are making in the cost of living crisis?
Yeah, well, one thing that sort of the Welsh government is looking at is the creation of a state-owned energy company, because as Keith said, Wales is in a similar situation to Scotland. We are a country that has the potential to generate a lot of green energy. So we've got a number of energy parks, that are either wind or solar or a combination of those online, and there are a number of those in the pipeline as well. So we have an opportunity there to contribute towards energy security, but the frustration is, as is with lots of these, is because the companies are owned by in many cases by companies that are based in Germany, France, and the sort of Norway and Finland and Sweden, that the profits actually sort of go out of Wales, into and out of the United Kingdom, and as I say, the need for energy from Scotland and Wales is to sort of power the households of England, where we have to remember 84% of the population of the United Kingdom live in England, and they are the ones who need the energy. So Wales, we've got a target here now to be creating all of our energy by 2030 in renewables. I think Scotland have already got there, and Wales is on course to do that. But one of the other things people need to remember as well is, with these companies who are setting up energy parks, is there is a requirement for them to sort of share part of those profits per megawatt with the communities where they're based, and this has potential, to sort of help rural economies, especially ones that are currently reliant on agriculture. And as you're aware, there's protests. I don't know if they've been up in Scotland, but certainly in Wales, the farmers have been out protesting because of the threat to their livelihoods.
Thank you, Hugh. Keith, I was probably a wee bit cheeky when I said that Scotland had been dragged out of the EU by the UK, and now it's been dragged into a recession along with the rest of the UK. But is there any truth in that? I mean, there's recently been good news about Scottish exports of whisky and salmon. Would things be different if Scotland were an independent country just now?
Absolutely, because the profits from those huge elements of the UK economy in terms of exporting whisky, and particularly Scotch whisky, and Scotch salmon and other products as well. First of all, it would be the situation, certainly I would hope, that an independent Scotland would be back in the EU. And so all the barriers that the Tories have created, they talk about tearing down barriers to trade. They're the ones that have erected 27 new borders, which are inhibiting trade across the UK and for Scotland as well. Again, we voted to stay in the EU, and that was just completely ignored, and now we're suffering the consequences of that, many of which are still to come. But some of the estimates of the damage that Brexit has done both to the Scottish and UK economy are eye-watering. Billions upon billions of pounds have been lost because of that. So yes, an independent Scotland could choose to eliminate those barriers The only border which would be there would be, of course, the one which is said to be an incredible barrier to trade, the border between England and Wales and Scotland. So England and Wales on the one half and Scotland on the other. But that, I remember all the stuff that was said around Brexit by Tory politicians saying that the border in Northern Ireland wasn't an issue. There's technical fixes. There's no big issue here. And yet suddenly the border, which already exists between England and Scotland, is going to be a huge problem. But at that time, of course, it wouldn't affect many goods at all. It wouldn't affect freedom of movement because we remain in the travel-free area along with Ireland. So it would not have a huge impact, but we would at that time be able to take down the 27 borders and all the barriers to trade which have now been erected. And I think also an independent Scotland would be well placed to make sure it had much improved transport links, ferry and otherwise, with the rest of the EU. If you look what Ireland has done now, and I think Wales has suffered from this because Ireland have just chosen to go around the UK now rather than coming through it as they would have done before, having to go through a non-EU country. So, yeah, I think having the power in Scotland, to go back to the previous topic, we don't have the control over our energy because we don't have the power, ironically enough, in Scotland. But if we were independent, then we could choose to make different decisions. And huge success stories like whisky and Scottish salmon could, of course, be used to come to a Scottish exchequer and benefit our public services.
Thank you, Keith. And Hugh, just as Keith mentioned there, Irish exporters, they've created a new sea link so that they can avoid having to come through England. And of course, it would have been through Wales, wouldn't it? The ferries would have gone from Dublin to was it Anglesey? I can't. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how's the Welsh?
One of the largest sort of shipping and transport companies that was based on Ynysmôn, where Holyhead, the port is. They went into sort of liquidation last week, so which is the direct impact because the amount of traffic is lost. And also remember, that the infrastructure in Wales, a lot of it has, that we've supposedly benefited from, has basically been there to connect England with Ireland. So you have the railway along the North Wales coast that goes to Holyhead. You've got the A5, which is the the dualling of the main road all the way across the north, and in the south you have the M4 corridor and the train that goes from London through to Fishguard at its end. So a lot of the infrastructure projects that are supposedly benefiting us, they're there to transport goods from Ireland to England, and obviously that is much reduced. And I think one of the things we look at, and this is the thing I find very frustrating with Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer from Labour, is that they're using this language of sort of the tax take as if it's the running a government is like running a household. When it comes to a budget, which is just nonsense. There are alternatives. We now know that austerity was a choice, and the countries that didn't follow that route actually prospered during that period by borrowing and investing. So there's the thing that worries me is in the future that if we do get a change of government in Westminster, we're not going to get much of a change from an economics perspective. And I think from Wales, I think Wales would benefit from being independent. It wouldn't be a bed of roses and it wouldn't be an improvement overnight, but in the long term, it's something as opposed to Brexit that was supposed to sort of benefit us over a longer period of time. Independence does have that track record. How many countries who have become independent from Britain have decided to go back? None.
Thank you, Hugh. So I'm just still intrigued about, maybe we should go public service cuts. I don't know, I'm intrigued to hear, how's the Welsh economy, this idea about the UK dragged Scotland out of the EU, and now it's dragged, it seems, Scotland into a recession. How's the Welsh economy doing? How would it be doing if it was independent?
The economy now is worse than it's ever been. And because of cuts in funding, local authorities are looking at making savings. The Welsh Government apparently didn't factor in the large inflation numbers last year, so they've had to make cuts. They've tried to ring fence education and health, but other departments have had to take a 10% hit, because it was interesting. Sort of Arts Council funding of Wales, there was a blanket 10% cut in the funding that had been awarded just before Christmas because of the cuts. I believe that they've managed to sort of do some in-house savings, so that has been reduced. But no, we're seeing cuts across lots of areas, and I think the big concern is, especially with local authorities who, the funding for schools and education come through. I'm a governor in a couple of schools, and the prospects for next term, financially, are very, very serious, because we're looking at a lot of schools are currently operating with deficits, and the only way that they're going to be able to sort of recoup money and to save money is by cutting staff. Sort of 90% of school budgets go on staff wages, so it's the only place to go. So it's that short-termism as well, that potentially we're going to be harming young people's education in order to save money in the short term. Well, long term, what's the impact that is going to have on those young people, their educations, and their ability to work and create wealth in future? But no, economically, I think the situation in Wales is worse than it is in England and Scotland.
Thank you, Hugh. We're weirdly ahead of time, but I think I'm going to go and. I'm sorry, the voice in my ear, I'm sure you both heard that as well. Public service cuts. We've got about 3 minutes before we need to move on to the next item. Keith, I'm thinking that there's probably something really important that I've missed because we're so weirdly ahead of time. But what do you have to say about public service cuts?
I think Hugh's right in terms of the long-term decline in the funds available to public services, which are having a real impact. You'll see it with councils having to wrestle with their budgets because it's a very difficult settlement. I'm perfectly willing to say that's the case, because the Scottish Government is also getting an appalling settlement after the autumn statement that we had and subsequent announcements from the UK Treasury, and that's who controls much of the purse strings. And the two things you can do to improve your economy, of course, are education, which Hugh's mentioned. That's a long-term, absolutely essential requirement. Ireland understood that issue and has done very well in relation to that. And it must be galling for people in Wales, as it is for people in Scotland, to look across the Irish Sea and see them with a £40 billion surplus when we're having huge cuts to our capital programme, as they are in Wales as well. Because the second part of it, education, is fundamental to economic growth, but so is investing in your infrastructure. These are the things that can produce increased productivity and increase the money available for public services. And I think we are really seeing now, and what's been talked about for many years, it's been true for many years, that long-term decline in the resources available to our public services. And that's what's having a real impact. And the way that you can deal with that is to properly invest. Now, it's ironic that the last words of the last Labour government was, "There is no money left," the Chief Secretary to the Treasury in 2010 when demitting office under the last Labour government. And yet the Tories, following austerity, have now got us in record levels of debt, 2.4 or 2.5 trillion pounds in debt, at the same time as having the highest tax burden since the Second World War. The economic mismanagement of the Conservatives is absolutely appalling. And that's not to mention, of course, the fact that this week we've gone into a second recession. And the real term cost of this will be our public services not having the resources they need to have in order to make sure that we can have a proper recovery. And that just takes me full back to the idea of independence. If I could just mention, if it's okay, that in terms of independence, this election coming up will be a hugely important one for people in Scotland. And to see Labour saying they're going to follow, Rachel Reeves, follow the same austerity policies, certainly for the first 2 years of any incoming Labour government, is absolutely disheartening. And above all of this, and I'm sure it will be true in Wales as well, people are so ground down by the items you've discussed in this programme, the energy costs, the cost of living increases, the wage suppression that we've had for 14, 15 years now. And the prospects of Westminster doing anything different, whether it's Labour or Tory, are pretty miserable. So independence, in my view, is just as you said, it's never going to be a garden of roses. We're going to have tough choices to make, but they'll be our choices and they'll be taken in our interest. So what we're seeing now is, as you know, the SNP have said if we have a majority of MPs elected from Scotland for the SNP, that will be a mandate to start independence negotiations. And just recently, we have started within the SNP talking to other parties and other elements of the Yes movement to make sure that we prepare for that potential constitutional convention that would happen in that circumstance, to marshal all the democratic forces in Scotland to make sure that mandate is respected and Scotland's route through to independence is there. Because in this miserablest UK, independence represents by far the best possibility of improving people's lives here in Scotland.
Thank you, Keith. There were two by-elections in England this week, and there was a massive swing to Labour. So Labour won both of those by-elections, which suggests that there's going to be a massive landslide in this year's general election. But what are the policies that Labour are offering, and how will they be received in Scotland and in Wales? Just as a wee bit extra, Alison Thulis, Anas Sarwar said that he would stand up to Starmer to defend Scotland this week, which begs the question why you think there would be any reason or any occasion for Starmer would have Scotland's interests at heart. Alison Thulis, SNP MP, said this is an astonishing own goal from Anas Sarwar, who has suggested Sir Keir Starmer could act against Scotland's interests and cannot be trusted. And as we've got Hugh here today, I'd include Wales in that statement as well. And I think, Keith, I did come to you first the last time. So, Hugh, how does the by-election results look from where you are?
Yeah, they were unsurprising. But what was interesting, well, the turnout was low. I don't think the Labour vote, although the swing was there, it did appear to be Conservative voters either not voting, some of them moving to sort of reform stroke Brexit, whatever that is now. But there's clearly, sort of very little appetite for the Conservatives. And it is frustrating to see, on a UK level, that Labour doesn't seem to be, have a coherent sort of message. And it's the fact that Rishi Sunak, every interview, he comes out with it. Starmer hasn't got a plan. That he has a plan and they're working on it and it's working, which in itself is nonsense. But it does make you think that if the Labour Party actually did publish a plan for what they intend to do, the likelihood is, it could be a couple of months, it could be, less than 9 months, or what they're going to do for the next 5 or potentially 10 years. It would be a good idea to let people know, but at the moment, I think, Labour support is, it's not down to, what they're offering, because nobody knows what they're offering. We know from Keir Starmer, who, like a parrot repeats the line that, that Labour has changed under him, that he's trying to sort of distance himself from the Corbyn era, in whose shadow cabinet he served, and tried to get Corbyn elected, at the last election. He's obviously wants to try and disassociate himself from that, despite Corbyn's policies being very popular amongst a lot of people. So yeah, I it's difficult to read anything into it apart from the fact that the Tories are, it is, they're fizzling out. It's the dying embers of a failing party. Because the popular Conservatives, which is an oxymoron in itself, launched last week with the absolutely bonkers Liz Truss. The fact that she's so disconnected from the fact that she was booted out by her own party after a matter of weeks because she was so awful as a Prime Minister, and her financial sort of plans. And I see that Kwasi Kwarteng standing down as an MP at the next election. Surprise, surprise. That they're still trying to sort of, I think there's about 6 different parties now within the Conservative Party. In Wales, all they have to say is, they knock the Welsh Labour government because of the 20 mile an hour legislation that they brought in. and it stopped the small boats. That's all they've got, and they're in denial here. I don't know what the Tories in Scotland are like, but in Wales, they're in total denial that their own party, who are governing in the UK, are an absolute shambles. So yeah, I think it's as time goes on, but I think it was interesting to see sort of recent polls showing that Plaid would probably actually increase their seats, because obviously we're losing 8 seats at the next election, going from 40 down to 32. So Plaid would potentially have 4 of the 32, which would be a good showing. But I think what I do worry about the impact that reform could have in Wales in Senedd elections, because we have a proportional representation system, which is a good thing. But it does mean that we had 7 or 8 UKIP representatives who were, just to let you know, that when they're actually in a sort of a legislature, they are absolutely useless and they offer nothing. So it is literally a wasted vote. But we'll see, what happens. But I have a feeling that between now and the election, I think Labour should win. It's theirs to lose. I think Starmer is being ultra cautious because he's terrified of some misstep. But I think you'll see in Scotland, I think the SNP will gain again. After the hard year they've had following Sturgeon's resignation and the police inquiry. I don't know it would be good if somebody in Scotland could update me as to what's happening with the police inquiry. That's all gone very quiet. But I think the SNP hopefully should sort of grow their support, and hopefully Plaid can have some sort of inroads in Wales. But I expect Labour to do well in Wales, but at the expense of the Conservatives.
Thanks, Hugh. Lots to think on there. You mentioned reform, so I think I'm right in saying that, and I think it was in Wellingborough that Ben Habib came third for Reform UK, and they won more than 10% for the first time. They came in third with 13%. Keith, I'm really intrigued to find out your perspective, because Anas Sarwar is a colleague of yours. You both share the same workplace. He's saying that he's going to stand up to Starmer, and yet the UK Labour and Scottish Labour, we know they don't really exist, that distinction, because but what is it actually like to be in the chamber with Anas Sarwar? How does he look when he's saying one thing but it looks like it's going to be the other?
Very uncomfortable sometimes, and Hamza Yusuf makes sure that he confronts Sarwar with the contradictions. The contradiction that's evident in that incredible statement, he will stand up to Starmer. I mean, it's just an incredible thing to be said. I mean, on one level, it's absolutely understandable, because you mentioned when an incoming Labour government, if that's what happens, takes decisions against the interests of the people of Scotland, whether Sarwar stands up to it. I see no evidence at all that he will. But the fact he needs to have to say that, there's nothing more guaranteed than the fact that an incoming Labour government will take decisions against the interests of the people of Scotland. They did that, of course, with the Iraq War, despite huge opposition in Scotland as well. But there's so many other examples. But I think we can overestimate the impact of these by-elections. The swings were eye-watering. There's no doubt about that. But I think if you look behind that, Labour's vote didn't really move. The share of the vote dramatically increased. That's the most important thing in any election. But their actual vote, people turning out to vote for Labour, didn't change much. In fact, I think it may have been down in both. I'm not sure of that. And given that, and given also what happened with Reform, it would not at all surprise me to see Reform, as they've done in the past, or the various iterations of Reform, do a deal with the Tories at the last minute so they don't stand against Tories and make sure they make it as easy as possible for Tories to regain seats they previously held. That's if it's not gone full circle and Farage is not actually leading the Tory party at that time, or whether Tice joins them, whatever. But it wouldn't surprise me if something like that happens. And in that scenario, the idea of this huge landslide, I think, becomes a bit more problematic. And added to that is the fact that Labour hasn't really, ditching the £38 billion Green Deal commitment. The number of stakeholders they are now alienating. They're doing it with young people, with people very concerned with the environment, people very concerned about Gaza. They're alienating huge chunks of their support, and they're deemed to be standing for nothing. All they are is living embodiment of the axiom that oppositions don't win elections, governments lose them. They're just waiting for it to fall into their hands. And I'm not saying that's not possible to be very effective. All I'm saying is it means that you can be very easily blown off course when people believe that you stand for nothing. And I think the crucial thing in Scotland will be the fact that people will see nothing will change, whether it's the same spending plans which Labour are committing to as the Tories have, or the rape clause will stay, the two-child cap, two horrendous things, which you would have thought on any day of the week Labour would oppose and ditch immediately, they're now signing up to. So we don't see any real change happening in Scotland, the fundamental change that we want. And yet we see other former EU partners like Ireland pushing ahead, investing in their economy, producing surpluses. Small Scandinavian countries, similar size to Scotland and Wales, really getting some of the best standards of living in the world. And yet Scotland is locked into this dysfunctional, broken Brexit Britain, isolationist. So I think we have to make sure that people can, in Scotland, if we're to see certainly the SNP prosper, it's up to us to make sure that we paint that better picture of what life could be without the wage suppression, without the food banks, without the pensioner poverty, one of the worst pensions that we have anywhere in Europe. And of course, people now, they're talking about making people work till they're 71 years old. That's the prospect of Brexit Britain. And we have to produce a prospectus that says that an independent Scotland can do so much better than this, and I'm sure the same would be true for Wales as well.
Thank you, Keith. We don't have much time left, but Hugh, you asked about how things are in Scotland. There was a poll recently, which is just a poll last week, which put the SNP ahead in Scotland. It said that Labour were going to win the general election with 254 votes. The Tories would end up with only 80. Lib Dems would come in with 53 seats. Scotland would SNP would win in Scotland, but with 40 SNPs. But they would come in fourth behind the Lib Dems, which means they would lose their question at PMQs. I'm really sorry, Hugh, I don't have the figures for Plaid Cymru. Maybe you might know the poll and you might be able to enlighten us. But Hugh, Keith, what do you think about the chances of losing our questions at PMQs?
Well, I think that they can be important. I mean, Stephen Flynn's done so well at this, being the question that most people wait for when they watch PMQs now to see what Stephen's going to do, because he skewers Rishi Sunak on a regular basis and asks the questions which Labour refused to ask. So that's an important point. But really, I'm most interested in Scotland. And if we have a situation where once again the SNP win the general election in Scotland, as you say, 40 out of 57 seats, would be an astonishing result. Then it's really time for Scotland to have its own path. Stop worrying too much about the third question at PMQ. Start worrying much more about how we improve the lives of people in Scotland, pensioners, children in Scotland, talking about child poverty, where even the limited action that we can currently take, like the child payments, made a massive difference in terms of child poverty. So that's probably more important to me. I'm not saying it's not important to have that question, especially given how well Stephen has used it, but much more important than the third question at PMQs is how we improve the lives of people of Scotland, and that's what the vote will be about when we get to the general election.
Thank you, Keith. And Hugh, just before we do go, maybe how is it looking for Plaid Cymru at the next general election?
Yeah, as I say, the polling suggests 3 or 4 seats. So as I say, the constituencies are changing. So a couple of Plaid seats are changing their sort of makeup. So there's, as I say, 32 seats instead of 40. We don't, we're not making the breakthroughs the SNP have had, and I think that's down in part to sort of Welsh Labour have been far more effective, as in sort of parking their tanks on Plaid Cymru's lawns, because people do see Labour Party as a sort of patriotically Welsh party, although sort of politically they are more to the left of Labour on a UK level. But again, I think one of the issues is the media, because people in Wales consume in the main English media, and the message they get is a choice between Starmer and Sunak. So that's one of the big things, and that's one of the reasons why I'm working on with Talking Wales. Is we need to have those better conversations within Wales and within Scotland about politics within our own countries.
Thank you, Hugh. And so we're definitely well out of time now, which you've just reminded me that I didn't give you both a proper introduction at the start of the show. Apologies for that. And thank you also again for giving up such a big chunk of your Sunday afternoons for us, both Hugh and Keith. But so that's it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. You know that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford anything at all, then please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We are now under £1,000 short of our £10,000 target. Although the pressure has been eased, we really need to raise that £1,000 now to pay our bills so that we can then focus on securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding. So once again, thank you to Hugh Marshall and Keith Brown for joining us today, and thank you to you for watching.